Before the Brooklyn Bridge became a triumph of steel and skyline, it was something far older and far darker, a hunger. Not the hunger of a city for progress, but the hunger of a project that seemed to demand payment in flesh before it would allow itself to exist. People like to say monuments are built on dreams. This one was built on a family's bodies, and the first sacrifice came before the first stone was even laid, before the first cable was strung, before the world had a single reason to fear the bridge, except the way great ambitions sometimes feel cursed the moment you touch them. Picture New York in the late 19th century, when the East River was less a scenic ribbon and more a living obstacle. Manhattan and Brooklyn were still separate cities, close enough to stare at each other, too separated to belong to each other. The river churned, the tides fought, the winter ice threatened. And the ferries, those wooden workhorses, were the fragile threads holding two worlds together. Every crossing was a reminder. The city was growing faster than its own infrastructure could breathe. On the docks, you could hear it in the slam of timber and rope, in the impatient feet of commuters, in the creak of hulls hitting pilings with a sound that felt like anger. And in that noise stood John A., Roebling, an engineer with the mind of a mathematician and the will of a prophet. He was not a man who merely designed structures. He designed inevitabilities. He believed a bridge could tame the river, that steel could do what wood and habit could not. He imagined two massive towers rising from the water like ancient gates, and between them, cables spun tight as vows. To Roebling, the Brooklyn Bridge was not a luxury. It was destiny, an answer to a city that had begun to outgrow its own geography. But destiny does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it announces itself with a mistake so small it feels insulting. A misstep, a miscalculation of distance, a moment of bad luck at the edge of a dock. It happened at a ferry slip during a routine survey, one of those practical tasks that never makes it into the heroic version of history. A wooden ferry approached the landing, heavy and blunt. Guided by habit and current, the dock waited with its thick posts and worn boards. The timing was off by a heartbeat. The ferry struck hard wood against wood with a sharp, brutal slam, and in that instant, Roebling's foot was caught, not a dramatic fall from a tower, not a heroic accident with sparks and steel, just a body at the wrong place at the wrong moment, pinned between a moving mass and an unyielding post. The injury itself was horrifying in a quiet way: crushed toes, shattered flesh. A wound that looked manageable if you were foolish enough to believe pain is always proportional to danger. That is the cruel trick of it. The smallest injuries can carry the deadliest futures. Roebling was treated. Doctors amputated what they had to. The city continued to move. The river kept churning. On paper, the project still lived. But something invisible had already entered the story. Infection, tetanus, the old enemy that thrives in wounds and turns the body into a prison. It doesn't strike like lightning. It tightens like a curse. It began slowly, then took control with a methodical cruelty, muscles locking, the jaw clenching, the body stiffening as if the man were being turned into stone from the inside. Imagine the particular horror of that death for an engineer. A mind still full of calculations. A mind still seeing towers and cables. Trapped inside a body that refuses to obey. And then the final humiliation, silence. Tetanus can steal speech by stealing the simplest mechanics of life: breathing, swallowing, opening your mouth. The man who could command steel could not command his own jaw. The man who could imagine a bridge across a raging river could not form a final sentence. Roebling died not in a cinematic explosion, but in a tightening room, locked inside his own body, leaving behind drawings, measurements, and a future he could no longer enter. That was the first payment, and it mattered not only because it was tragic, but because of who inherited the tragedy. Washington Roebling, his son, stepped into the vacancy like a man stepping into a shadow that suddenly becomes his shape. He did not inherit a finished project. He inherited an unfinished prophecy and an unspoken command: continue. In the public record, this transition can look neat, even logical, father to son, genius to genius. But inside the family, it was something else entirely. It was grief stapled to responsibility. It was ambition fused to mourning. It was a bridge already demanding a second sacrifice. Because when a visionary dies before his vision is born, the survivors don't just build, they try to resurrect. Washington Roebling wasn't merely taking over a job, he was taking over a fate. He carried his father's plans like scripture. But he also carried something heavier, the sense that the bridge had already claimed one Roebling, and might not stop at one. And here's where the hook becomes a warning to the listener. The Brooklyn Bridge is often introduced as a symbol of American progress. A love letter in stone and steel, an icon on postcards. But if you begin at the beginning at the ferry dock, at the crushed toes, at the slow, tightening death, you see a different story. You see a project that begins with a bruise and ends with a legend. You see the first hint of a bridge of blood, not because it was designed to kill, but because the scale of what it demanded exceeded the scale of what any one human life could comfortably pay. So let that image stay with you as the episode opens. The river slapping the pilings, the ferry slamming into the dock, the sudden scream of wood, and an engineer staring down at the smallest possible accident, an accident that would erase him from the world and push his son into the path of the same monster. The bridge had not even begun. And already it was taking what it wanted. If the hook is a death that begins at the surface, an accident on a dock, then the context is the realization that the Brooklyn Bridge was never truly built above water. It was built under it. And that's where you find the real curse of the project. Not in superstition, but in engineering so extreme it forced human bodies to operate outside their natural limits. The East River is not a gentle river. It's a tidal strait, restless and muscular, a corridor of moving water that behaves like an argument between the ocean and the city. The currents can pull hard. The depths can hide soft mud and dangerous rock. And the bottom is not a stable floor, but an unpredictable mix of sediment and debris. In the 1,870 seconds. The idea of anchoring enormous stone towers into that chaos, then stringing steel cables across to hold a suspended roadway was so audacious, it felt like a dare against nature. Bridges existed, yes. Suspension bridges existed, yes. But not like this. Not with this span. Not with this weight. Not with the kind of steel that still felt new enough to make people nervous. So the question wasn't, how do you build a bridge? It was, how do you build foundations where water refuses to let you touch the ground? The answer was a technology that sounds almost like fiction. Caissons, massive wooden boxes, built like upside-down ships, lowered to the riverbed and pressurized with air so workers could enter and dig beneath the waterline without drowning. Picture it, a giant chamber with an open bottom, sunk into the mud like a boot stepping into a swamp. Pumps force compressed air into the chamber, pushing the water out. Inside, men can stand on the riverbed itself, dry but trapped in a world that feels wrong. Because the air pressure is far higher than anything your body is meant to live in. It's hard to overstate how alien that would feel. Step into a caisson and the atmosphere changes instantly. Your ears strain and pop. Your chest feels heavier. Your breathing feels thick. The air is not just air, it's a weight. The chamber is dim, lit by lamps that carve weak halos through floating dust. The temperature climbs quickly because compressed air and labor create heat, turning the box into a furnace. You sweat constantly. The noise is relentless, pumps thumping, tools scraping, mud sloshing, wood groaning, men shouting over machinery. Above you is a ceiling. Beneath you is riverbed. Around you is pressure that makes your body feel like it's being squeezed by an invisible fist. And then there's the psychological terror, that above your head is a river, thousands of tons of water. If something fails a seal, a joint, a pump water will not politely seep in. It will explode into the chamber like an animal. There is no graceful escape. There is only panic, and a ladder, and a race against physics. Now imagine doing this day after day. Men in the caissons were not only building foundations, they were performing a daily descent into an engineered underworld. They shoveled mud and rock, loaded it into buckets, sent it up through shafts. They worked in air so thick it made them feel drunk. They endured nosebleeds, headaches, dizziness, and that eerie sensation of being slightly detached from their own bodies. Their eardrums strained, their joints ached, their skin burned with heat. Some men came out trembling, some came out laughing too loudly, as if the brain had to turn fear into mania to survive. But the true horror wasn't what happened inside the caisson. It was what happened when you left, because the human body doesn't adjust smoothly to rapid changes in pressure. When you are in a high-pressure environment, gases, especially nitrogen, dissolve into your blood and tissues. If you return to normal pressure too quickly, that dissolved gas forms bubbles. Tiny bubbles become weapons. They block blood vessels, irritate nerves, and attack the body from the inside. This is decompression sickness, what workers called the bends. The name almost sounds playful. The reality was not. Some men emerged from caisson shifts and felt pain so sudden and sharp it looked like punishment. Joints locked, muscles spasmed, limbs went numb. Some collapsed on the spot, unable to stand, as if the bridge had reached up from beneath the river and grabbed them by the spine. Others suffered paralysis. Others suffered mysterious neurological damage, vision problems, hearing problems, chronic pain that never left. In the worst cases, men died, and the cause of death looked confusing to outsiders because there was no dramatic wound, just a body that seemed to break apart internally. This was the bridge's second appetite, not a single accident, but a system that consumed health in exchange for progress. The caissons made the impossible possible. But they also turned the project into a kind of slow industrial sacrifice. And here's the bitter truth. The technology was new enough that the danger wasn't fully understood, or was understood and simply accepted. The 19th century had a particular ruthlessness about labor. If the project was grand, the losses could be framed as unfortunate, like weather. Workers were replaceable in the public imagination. Even their suffering could be absorbed into the myth of progress. Men got hurt because great things require toughness. The city applauded the idea of the bridge while remaining comfortably distant from the underworld that made it real. Meanwhile, above the river, the towers began to rise. Stone on stone, massive blocks lifted into place, the skyline slowly changed, and the public saw only the visible miracle, the growing shape of a bridge that promised to erase distance. But in the shadows beneath the river, the caissons kept chewing through earth, and the human cost kept accumulating quietly, steadily, like interest on a debt nobody wanted to calculate. This is the context that turns a construction story into a tragedy. The Brooklyn Bridge is not simply a testament to engineering. It's also a testament to how far a society will push bodies, workers' bodies, engineers' bodies, families' bodies, when ambition is framed as destiny. Which brings us back to the Roeblings. Because if the caissons were hell for the workers, they also became the trap that would claim the bridge's second Roebling, not through random accident, but through devotion. Washington Roebling was not the kind of man who could manage a project like this from a clean office. He believed in seeing, touching, verifying. He went down into the caissons. He entered the underworld. And in doing so, he stepped into the most dangerous equation of all: genius plus proximity to risk. Washington Roebling inherited his father's vision the way some people inherit a family illness, with love, with dread, and with the quiet understanding that refusal would not set him free. He was young enough to be driven by pride, trained enough to be disciplined, and haunted enough to be reckless in the particular way. Ambitious sons can be reckless, trying to prove that tragedy will not dictate their future. If John Roebling's death was the bridge's first demand, Washington's suffering would become its most cinematic cruelty, not a quick death, but a prolonged captivity, because Washington was not merely managing a construction project. He was managing an industrial underworld. The caissons were the bridge's beating heart, and they were constantly flirting with disaster. Air pressure, heat, machinery, mud, water, everything in that equation could turn lethal with a small failure. A leak, a jam, a spark. And when things went wrong down there, you couldn't delegate heroism. You couldn't send a memo. You either descended into the box yourself or you accepted that men might die because you stayed above. Washington said yes to dissent. It's important to feel what that choice means. The engineer is supposed to be the brain, not the body. The engineer is supposed to calculate risk, not absorb it. But Washington Roebling was the kind of mind that wanted certainty. And in a place as unforgiving as a caisson, certainty often required presence. He went down into the pressurized chambers to inspect conditions, to troubleshoot, to make decisions with his eyes rather than his imagination. He moved through the hot, dim air where men sweated and bled from their noses, where lamps threw weak circles of light, where the river sat above like a threat held in suspension. Then came the moment that turns this story from difficult to cursed, a fire. In a normal building, fire is terrifying but comprehensible. Smoke, flames, exits. In a caisson, fire is almost mythic because it happens in a sealed chamber under pressure. Heat becomes a weapon. Smoke has nowhere to escape. Panic compresses as hard as the air. The instinct to flee runs into ladders and narrow shafts, and the horrifying knowledge that above you is a river. In that environment, emergency becomes a race, not just against time, but against physics. Washington went down during such a crisis, driven by the same trait that made his father a visionary: refusal to accept limits. He helped coordinate response. He stayed longer than safety would advise. And then, because emergencies demand speed, he ascended too quickly. This is where the bridge's villain reveals itself as something invisible. No collapsing beams, no dramatic explosion, just pressure. When you spend time in compressed air, nitrogen dissolves into your blood and tissues. If you come up too fast, the pressure drops rapidly and the nitrogen forms bubbles. Those bubbles don't just hurt, they invade. They block, they inflame, they attack nerves. They turn the body's internal highways into traffic jams of gas. That is decompression sickness, the bends. And in the 19th century, it could strike like a curse because people didn't yet have the full vocabulary to understand what they were seeing. A healthy man suddenly broken by nothing you can point to. Washington Roebling came up and paid for it. The symptoms could begin with pain sharp, deep, joint pain that feels like something is grinding inside you. Then numbness, weakness, dizziness. In severe cases, paralysis. The most terrifying part is the unpredictability. You don't know which part of your body the bubbles will attack. Legs, arms, spine, vision, hearing. The nervous system becomes a battlefield. For Washington, the consequences were catastrophic. At only 35 years old, the age when a man expects his strength to be at its peak, he became physically shattered. The engineer responsible for the most ambitious bridge in the world was suddenly unable to walk like an ordinary man. He couldn't tolerate noise. He couldn't tolerate bright light. The simplest stimuli became agony. His body, once an instrument of leadership, became a prison. And this is the emotional core of the struggle. The bridge did not kill him. It trapped him. It forced him to remain alive inside a damaged body. Aware enough to think, to plan, to regret yet unable to participate in the world he was building. That kind of suffering is different from death. Death ends a story. This kind of suffering elongates it into something almost unbearable. Now imagine the cinematic image your episode is designed to deliver. Washington Roebling in a dark room in Brooklyn Heights. Curtains drawn, air still. The city's noise held at bay like an enemy. A man who once stood inside the pressurized underworld now sits in near darkness because sunlight hurts him. His muscles weakened. His nerves inflamed, emphasizes every sound. He becomes a ghost in his own life, but he refuses to surrender the bridge. This is where the story turns almost supernatural in its determination. Washington cannot stand on the construction site. He cannot walk among the towers. He cannot climb scaffolding. So he does the next most haunting thing. He watches from afar. He uses a telescope to stare across the river at the rising stone towers and the web of cables being spun into existence. His eyes become his legs. His mind becomes his hands. The bridge becomes both his purpose and his torment. Visible but unreachable. From that dark room, he dictates, he sends instructions, he reviews calculations. He pushes the project forward through letters and intermediaries. In public, the world still sees Washington Roebling, chief engineer. In private, the chief engineer is a man who can barely endure the sound of life. And that gap between public image and private reality breeds suspicion. People in authority circles, in newspapers, in the city's political bloodstream, begin to whisper, is he truly in control? Is the bridge being run by a cripple? Is the project drifting? Is the Roebling genius evaporating under the weight of suffering? The bridge is already expensive, already controversial, already risky. Shows of weakness are treated like threats. Washington becomes not only a casualty but a liability in the eyes of the impatient. This is when the bridge's tragedy reaches beyond one body and begins to pull in the final character who will define its destiny, Emily Roebling. Because Washington's disability creates a vacuum, and vacuums in history are dangerous. They get filled by politics, ego, and opportunists. If the bridge is to survive, someone must become the living connection between the ghostly commander and the chaotic construction site. Someone must translate genius into action. Someone must walk where Washington cannot. The Brooklyn Bridge was supposed to be a clean story. Genius imagines. Labor builds. The city applauds. But once Washington Roebling became a prisoner of his own body, the story threatened to rot into something uglier: politics. Ridicule. Power grabs. The kind of slow sabotage that kills projects, not with explosions, but with committees and whispers. A bridge can survive wind and water. It struggles against doubt. And in that moment of doubt, the project found its unlikely savior not in another celebrated engineer, not in a loud new visionary, but in a woman the era was never prepared to credit. Emily Roebling. History often treats wives as footnotes, as decorative presences standing beside great men in photographs. But in the Brooklyn Bridge story, the wife becomes the crucial mechanism. Emily did not inherit a bridge the way Washington did. She was pulled into it like a person being dragged toward a fire. Her husband was suffering. The project was threatened, and the city's suspicion was sharpening. If Washington could not physically command the site, someone had to become his body in the world. Emily became that body. At first, it must have looked like simple devotion, a wife carrying messages. But devotion alone cannot hold a bridge together. Soon, the messages required understanding. The instructions became technical. The calculations grew intricate. The bridge wasn't a poem. It was a system of forces, tolerances, cable tensions, and structural logic to relay Washington's decisions properly. Emily needed more than loyalty. She needed mastery. So she taught herself. Imagine what that means in the 1,870 seconds, an early 1,880 seconds. A woman educating herself in advanced mathematics and engineering concepts, not because society permitted it, but because fate demanded it. She learned strength of materials. She learned cable construction. She learned the language of loads and stress and equilibrium. She learned how to speak to men who were trained to dismiss her. She learned how to walk into meetings where she would be treated as an interloper and leave those meetings with decisions executed. She became, in effect, the bridge's translator, converting Washington's mind into action on the ground. And for 11 years, 11 long, grinding years, Emily moved between two worlds. The dark room where Washington watched the bridge through a telescope like a ghost haunting his own dream, and the brutal, noisy construction site where stone rose, cables spun, and men worked under pressure and danger. She carried not only information but authority. She became the calm center in a project surrounded by friction. This is where the episode's climax gains its emotional twist. The bridge of blood becomes also a bridge of partnership. The Roebling family sacrifices not only father and son, it is wife as well, her youth, her energy, her reputation, her private life, all absorbed into a public monument that would never fully repay her. Yet even as the bridge neared completion, the curse-like pattern continued. Whenever the story seemed ready to turn triumphant, blood returned. The opening day should have been pure celebration. By 1883, the towers stood like stone prophets on either side of the East River. The cables, those thick braids of steel, hung in elegant arcs, making the bridge look like a harp strung between two cities. Brooklyn and Manhattan were finally about to be stitched together permanently. People had waited years. They had watched headlines, endured delays, heard rumors of corruption and catastrophe, and still the bridge had kept rising. Now it was here, an event large enough to feel like a holiday. Thousands came, then tens of thousands. They walked onto the deck with a kind of reverence, as if stepping into the future. The air was electric. You can imagine the texture of that crowd. Families in their best clothes. Laborers proud to see what their city had achieved. Politicians hungry for credit. Visitors turning their faces upward at the cables like pilgrims looking at a cathedral ceiling. And then one small incident, a slip, a stumble. A body goes down on a staircase or walkway where people are packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, moving like a single organism. Someone screams. Someone else doesn't see the fall but hears the scream and supplies the worst possible explanation. Two words that can poison any crowd. The bridge is collapsing. Panic spreads faster than truth. In a crowd, fear has no patience for verification. The mass surges. People push, people claw for space that doesn't exist. The bridge that had been built to carry weight suddenly carries a different load. The collective terror of 1,000 minds losing control at once. In that terror, humanity becomes brutal. Not because most individuals are cruel, but because crowds are animals. They trample without intending to. They kill without choosing to. They turn accidents into massacres. In that stampede, 12 people died crushed, suffocated, broken on a bridge that had been open only days. The symbolism is almost unbearable. The city finally gets its miracle and immediately spills blood across it. The bridge would not allow itself to be inaugurated without a reminder of its appetite. This tragedy also sharpened the public's lingering fear. If a rumor could kill 12 people, what would a real failure do? The bridge's strength was still a matter of faith for ordinary citizens. They needed proof, not in equations, but in spectacle. People don't trust engineering, they trust what they can see survive. And that is why this chapter's climax is not only the stampede, it's what comes after. The strange ritual the city requires to calm itself. A performance of strength. A demonstration so absurd it becomes unforgettable. After the stampede, the Brooklyn Bridge had a problem no engineer can solve with a wrench: public terror. The bridge could be structurally sound and still feel unsafe. Because safety is not only physics, it's psychology. 12 people had died, not from failure, but from the fear of failure. And fear is contagious. It spreads through rumor, through memory, through the way a tragedy stains a place, even when the place did nothing wrong. The bridge was now both miracle and menace. It had opened the future and immediately reminded everyone that the future could kill them. In the days that followed, the city tried to restore normality. Officials insisted the bridge was safe. Engineers spoke in calm, precise language about load capacity, cable strength, and the stone towers, foundations. But numbers don't comfort crowds. A terrified population doesn't want calculations, it wants proof. It can feel in its bones. People wanted to see something heavy cross the span and survive. They wanted a ritual, not a lecture. And when a city demands a ritual, it often turns to the one profession that understands public belief better than politicians or engineers: showmanship. Enter P. Is Barnum. Barnum was not an engineer. He was a master of spectacle. He understood that the quickest way to defeat fear is to drown it in an image too bold to ignore. He knew the public's mind isn't persuaded by footnotes. It's persuaded by symbols. And what symbol could be more persuasive, more primal than the heaviest living things people could imagine? Elephants. Picture the absurdity of the scene and how perfectly it fits your series' tone. A bridge born in tragedy and ambition, now seeking salvation through a circus procession. The city that built the most advanced structure of its time needed a parade to believe in its own invention. It is both glorious and humiliating, a perfect New York contradiction. Barnum arranged for a procession across the bridge. Elephants led in a line, their massive feet thudding against the deck. The very sound would have mattered, the deep percussion of weight, the audible confirmation that the structure could hold something that looked like it belonged to myth rather than to Manhattan. The animals were not merely crossing. They were performing a public exorcism. Each step was a message. If the bridge can carry this, it can carry you. The image becomes almost surreal when you let it breathe. The stone towers looming like medieval gates, the cables curving above like giant harp strings, and beneath them a line of elephants, gray bodies moving slowly, deliberately, as if they too understood they were part of a civic drama. You can imagine spectators lining the sides, eyes wide, half laughing, half praying. There's a strange tenderness in it, a city using animals as proof of safety because its own fear had become too large for words. And here is the deeper resonance. The elephants weren't just about load. They were about trust. They were about the public's need to see strength, not be told strength exists. Engineering is invisible when it works. The Brooklyn Bridge's genius lived inside steel wires, inside compressive stone, inside calculations that ordinary citizens could not translate into confidence. Barnum translated it for them in the oldest language, spectacle. But the elephants also underline the bridge's central irony, one that makes your bridge of blood message land with emotional force. The bridge had already taken so much. John Roebling died from a trivial accident that became a slow, merciless death. Washington Roebling survived but lost his body, his comfort, his freedom, living as a commander in darkness. Emily Roebling surrendered years of her life, her youth and her private identity, to carry a project that history would try to credit to men alone. Workers descended into caissons and came back damaged or didn't come back at all. The bridge was braided with pain long before it was braided with steel. And still, after all that, the public needed elephants to believe. That's not an insult to the public. It's a portrait of humanity. We rely on stories because we are built to fear what we can't measure with our own senses. The Brooklyn Bridge asked people to trust a technology new enough to feel like sorcery. The bridge wasn't only a structure. It was a psychological leap across the river, an agreement to let modernity carry you. Once the elephants crossed and the world did not end, the city's body relaxed. The bridge began to normalize, to become part of the daily pulse. People walked it not as an event, but as a habit. Carriages rolled across. The skyline absorbed the towers as if they had always been there. The curse became a legend. The blood became history. That is what time does. It turns sacrifice into monument, and monument into scenery. But your episode's ending shouldn't be scenery. It should be a knife, so close with the truth beneath the spectacle. The Brooklyn Bridge is not merely a way to get from Manhattan to Brooklyn. It is a family tragedy turned into infrastructure. It is proof that when a society demands miracles, it rarely asks who will pay. John paid with his life. Washington paid with his body. Emily paid with her youth and her anonymity. Workers paid with their lungs, their joints, their futures. And then, when the bridge finally stood, the city demanded one last performance elephant so it could believe its own ambition was not cursed. That is the bridge's lesson. And it fits the theme of your series perfectly. The structures that define a city are often built to protect people from nature, but they cannot protect builders from fate. The Brooklyn Bridge connected two shores. Yes, but it also connected human genius to its most brutal price.